In the dry heat of Southern California, where orchards stretched for miles and rural towns struggled to define themselves in the shadow of Los Angeles, there stood a small chicken farm in Wineville. To passers-by, it was unremarkable, just another patch of dust, wood, and wire coops in an endless sprawl of farmland. But behind the ordinary, beneath the scratching of hens and the smell of feed, something darker was unfolding. It was here in 1928 that whispers began to curl through the desert air, whispers that grew into a storm of dread, forever tying the name Wineville to one of the most disturbing chapters in American criminal history. At the center of this story was a man whose quiet exterior masked something far more sinister. Gordon Stewart Northcott, a Canadian immigrant with a restless ambition, moved into the region with his mother and nephew, presenting himself as little more than a farmer, a hard-working man scraping by like so many others in California's booming agricultural economy. Yet while neighbors exchanged pleasantries with him at markets and watched him tend to his coops, strange signs began to appear, flickers of unease that no one could fully articulate until it was too late. This was an age when rural California was still untamed, its people caught between the promise of modernity and the grit of frontier living. Land was cheap, towns were growing, and migrants flowed in with dreams of fortune. But law enforcement was thin, oversight was lax, and entire stretches of countryside fell into shadow where secrets could thrive. It was in this gap between progress and isolation that Northcott built his world. He used the solitude of his land as a stage for something unspeakable, a performance carried out not in the glare of public streets but in the silent fields where screams could dissolve into the horizon. When the first boys disappeared, few connected the dots. California in the late 1920s was chaotic, crowded, and full of movement. Children vanished in cities, runaways drifted onto roads, and tragedies often went untraced. But as the pattern grew, as more families clutched photographs of their missing sons, rumors began to weave themselves together into something larger. And all paths, in time, seemed to point back to the chicken farm. The setting itself could not have been more ordinary. Wooden sheds stood crooked in the dust. Wire cages rattled when the wind swept through the valley. The smell of poultry feed and manure clung to everything. Yet within that ordinary landscape, investigators would later uncover evidence so horrifying that it shattered the illusions of safety in rural life. It was not just a farm. It was a place where innocence was undone, where laughter was silenced, and where the bones of tragedy would eventually be unearthed. This story is not only about a killer and his victims, but about the collision of culture, fear, and justice in a rapidly changing America. It is about the ways communities struggled to reconcile horror with the facade of normalcy, about how newspapers sensationalized grief to sell papers, and about how lawmen of the time pursued justice in an era before forensic science could offer clear answers. Above all, it is about the silence of the land itself, the silence that allowed cruelty to take root in the soil and grow unchecked until it demanded to be seen. Tonight, we will walk slowly into the shadow of Wineville, retracing each step from the dust of the chicken farm to the courtroom where the truth was dragged, trembling into daylight. This will not be an easy journey. The crimes committed here remain some of the most unsettling in American history, not just for their brutality, but for what they revealed about the fragility of trust, family, and community. So listen carefully and do not rush. For in the silence of the fields, in the forgotten coops and abandoned sheds, history still whispers, and the echoes of 1928 have not entirely faded. To understand why the events at Wineville shocked the nation so deeply, we must first step into the world of California in the 1920s. It was a place caught between two identities, the promise of modern America and the lingering grit of frontier life. Cities like Los Angeles were booming, swelling with migrants, real estate investors, and Hollywood dreamers. But just beyond the glow of the city lights stretched vast rural landscapes where life was still hard, simple, and often unforgiving. Wineville belonged to this second world, a farming community where chickens outnumbered people, and where dusty roads separated small plots of land tilled by families who clung to the hope of building something permanent. California in this era was both opportunity and illusion. The state drew immigrants from across the nation and beyond, Midwesterners escaping droughts, Mexicans seeking work in the fields, and Canadians like Gordon Stewart Northcott chasing an elusive idea of prosperity. Land could be purchased cheaply, and poultry farms offered a way for struggling families to scratch out a living. But survival in this environment required toughness, a willingness to work from sunrise to sunset, and a certain solitude. That solitude, while cherished by many, also created spaces where law and order struggled to reach, and where secrets could fester in silence. American society as a whole was in transition. The 1920s were known as the Roaring Twenties, a time of jazz, flappers, and new cultural freedoms. Cities celebrated modernity, industry, and speed, yet rural communities often felt left behind, clinging to older traditions, stricter religious codes, and conservative values. Wineville was one such place, where neighbors knew each other's names, church bells defined the rhythm of weeks, and gossip traveled faster than newspapers. But for all its closeness, this was not a community with the tools to confront the kind of evil that was quietly nesting within its borders. The justice system itself reflected the era's contradictions. Police forces were growing but remained underfunded in rural areas. Forensic science was in its infancy, fingerprinting was known, but DNA analysis was decades away. Detectives often relied on intuition, confessions, or crude physical evidence. The absence of modern investigative tools made it possible for crimes, even horrific ones, to linger unsolved for months, sometimes years. When children vanished, lawmen often assumed they had run away, or worse, they simply lacked the resources to search beyond their jurisdictions. This weakness in the system created openings that men like Northcott could exploit. Culturally, Americans were deeply concerned with morality. The 1920s were an age of prohibition, when alcohol was outlawed, and moral reform movements attempted to reshape society. Churches preached against sin, and newspapers often framed crime as a symptom of declining values in the face of modern change. In such a moral climate, the Wineville murders would later be interpreted not merely as individual crimes, but as evidence of a sickness in the culture itself, a sign that America's race toward modernity had left something dark in its wake. The fear was not only of Northcott himself, but of what his actions said about the fragility of community and the vulnerability of children in an age of dislocation. Within this context, families like the victims lived lives that were both simple and precarious. Many worked the fields or held low-paying jobs in the city, relying on tight-knit kinship networks to survive. Children were expected to help with chores, to walk to school, and to return by evening. Trust between neighbors was assumed. Doors were rarely locked, and the idea that someone in the community could harbor violence was nearly unthinkable. It was precisely this trust, this cultural assumption of safety, that Northcott manipulated. His farm was just far enough from prying eyes, and his manner outwardly polite enough, that suspicions failed to take root until it was too late. The media environment of the time also played a role. Newspapers were the dominant source of information, and they thrived on sensational stories. Crime reporting was often lurid, with headlines designed to shock. When the Wineville case finally broke, it became front-page news not only in California, but across the country. The contrast between the humble chicken farm and the enormity of the crimes created a narrative that editors could not resist. But before the case reached that stage, the silence of rural life and the limitations of local reporting allowed Northcott's world to remain hidden in plain sight. Even the name Wineville carried cultural resonance. It was a town trying to build its identity, shaped by vineyards, farms, and a population eager to be part of California's promise. But after 1928, the name became synonymous with horror, to the point that the community would later change it to Mira Loma, attempting to erase the shadow that had fallen over its history. Yet names cannot fully erase memory, and the ghost of Wineville continues to linger in the cultural imagination. To grasp the depth of the horror that unfolded there, one must imagine not only the crimes themselves, but the broader backdrop, a society that believed itself on the cusp of progress yet remained vulnerable to its blind spots. A landscape vast enough to hide atrocities, a justice system too underdeveloped to swiftly confront them, a culture torn between modern optimism and old fears. Against this backdrop, the Wineville chicken farm became more than just the setting for a crime. It became a mirror reflecting the fragility of community trust and the limits of American progress. As we move deeper into this story, keep this historical context in mind. The crimes that shocked the world in 1928 did not happen in isolation. They were born of their time and place out of the soil of California's rural ambitions, the shadows of its rapid growth, and the silence of its forgotten corners. To understand the terror of Wineville, we must first understand the America that allowed it to happen. The story of the Wineville murders is not told in a single moment of violence, but in a series of chilling incidents that together formed a tapestry of horror. Each incident revealed something new about the cruelty festering behind the walls of the Northcott chicken farm, and each left behind echoes that the families of the victims, and the community at large, would never fully escape. It began with disappearances, small at first, barely noticed in the rhythm of everyday life. A child who did not return home from running errands, another who failed to make it to school. At the time, such vanishings were often explained away by police and neighbors alike. "He must have run away," they would say, or "she probably went to stay with relatives." The lack of swift investigative tools allowed these early alarms to be muffled. But in the silence of rural California, children were vanishing, and they were not returning. The Gordon Stewart Northcott farm stood on a dusty road, isolated from the heart of Wineville. To outsiders, it appeared ordinary: rows of chicken coops, the smell of livestock, and the impression of a family enterprise. But behind the wire fencing and wooden sheds lay something darker. Neighbors sometimes heard noises, screams muffled by distance, sudden bursts of hammering at odd hours, or the sound of an axe striking wood when no construction was underway. Few dared to ask questions. In a rural town, privacy was respected even when it grew uncomfortable. Inside the farmhouse, however, reality twisted into nightmare. Northcott, aided by his mother and sometimes his nephew, had created a system of cruelty. Children brought to the farm were promised work, food, or safety, but instead were trapped. The isolation of the property gave their captors time, and time in this context became a weapon. Days stretched into terror, where the young victims lived in fear of what would come next. Their cries dissolved into the vastness of the fields, swallowed by the California night. One incident, recounted later by witnesses, spoke of a boy who tried to escape. He ran across the dusty yard barefoot, desperate for freedom. The chase was short. Northcott, carrying an axe, caught him before he reached the fence line. What followed was swift and brutal, a moment of violence that neighbors did not see, but later heard described in court. The body was buried in haste, the ground disturbed only briefly before silence returned to the farm. The earth itself seemed to conspire in hiding the crime. Another victim, older than the others, resisted more fiercely. His struggle left marks on the walls of the chicken coop, scratches that investigators would later find, faint but undeniable. The boy fought with everything he had, but he too was overpowered. In the farm's dark sheds, instruments of labor, hammers, shovels, axes became tools of execution. The ordinariness of these objects only heightened the horror. They were meant to build, to farm, to sustain life, and yet here they had been turned into instruments of death. The silence surrounding these incidents was broken only when the Northcotts themselves grew careless. A neighbor noticed strange fires at night, flames licking at the sky as if trash was being burned. The smell was not of wood or refuse, but of something heavier, sickening, though no one dared to confirm their suspicions. A passing traveler swore he saw children on the property who later vanished without explanation. Each piece of information formed a puzzle that no one could yet bring themselves to assemble. The most harrowing accounts came later from Northcott's nephew, Sanford Clark, who was forced into complicity. He described nights when children were locked in the coop, their cries audible beneath the clucking of chickens. He spoke of his uncle's rages, sudden and unpredictable, and of the cold instructions given by Northcott's mother, who seemed as invested in the cruelty as her son. The boy's testimony painted a picture of a family enterprise in murder, where violence was not only tolerated, but systematized. There was the case of the Winslow brothers, Nelson and Lewis, who vanished in May of 1928 after attending a church event in Pomona. Their disappearance sparked more public concern than earlier vanishings, for they came from a family that pushed relentlessly for answers. Their fate, too, led back to Wineville. Witnesses placed them near Northcott's farm, and Sanford later confirmed their presence there. Their struggle, like that of the others, ended with tools meant for farming turned into weapons, their bodies buried and later destroyed in desperate attempts to erase evidence. Even when the law finally approached, the farm remained a stage of denial. Northcott presented himself as confident, sometimes even charming, dismissing accusations as fabrications. But investigators began to unearth bones and fragments from shallow graves, scraps that the fires had failed to consume. Each discovery added weight to the suspicions, transforming rumors into undeniable evidence. The farm itself seemed to confess through the soil, yielding up the remains of those who had screamed in vain. The incidents at Wineville were not singular explosions of violence, but repeated performances of cruelty. Each victim brought in, each life extinguished, marked another chapter in a ritual of terror. Neighbors, hearing faint echoes, later recalled their unease but admitted their silence. The broader community, when faced with the truth, struggled to reconcile the friendly veneer of a family farm with the atrocities that had occurred there. This dissonance became part of the horror, the realization that such evil could hide behind ordinary walls, and that its signs had been visible all along. As the investigation deepened, the scale of the crimes became clear. Wineville was no longer a quiet farming town, but the epicenter of one of America's most disturbing murder cases. What had once been dismissed as disappearances, chalked up to restless children or unfortunate missteps, now stood revealed as the work of a predator shielded by isolation and silence. Each incident, once brushed aside, became part of a timeline that led inexorably to the collapse of Northcott's facade. And yet, even as bones were unearthed and testimonies collected, uncertainty lingered. How many victims had there truly been? How many cries had gone unheard in the California night? The exact number was never established, for evidence had been destroyed and silence had covered the rest. In this uncertainty lies the deepest horror of Wineville, not only the brutality of the crimes, but the knowledge that their full extent may never be known. The farm itself stood as both crime scene and graveyard, a place where ordinary life had been twisted into something monstrous. For those who later walked its grounds, the silence was overwhelming, broken only by the rustle of wind through dry grass. The land seemed stained, a reminder that the soil of progress and opportunity could just as easily nurture despair and cruelty. And in the quiet aftermath of each incident, the town of Wineville drew closer to the day when its name would be forever linked to horror. When the truth of the Wineville chicken coop murders finally began to surface, the reactions of families, neighbors, and the wider society unfolded in waves: shock, denial, rage, and a deep lingering sorrow. It was as though the entire community had awoken to discover that the ordinary rhythms of farm life had concealed a theater of horror. The initial disbelief was palpable. How could a simple chicken farm, so unremarkable in appearance, be the site of such atrocities? For the families of the missing children, the revelations were both devastating and strangely confirming. Many had lived for months with unanswered questions, their pleas to authorities often dismissed with casual explanations of runaway children. When investigators began to connect the disappearances to Gordon Stewart Northcott, parents found themselves torn between grief and fury, not only at the man himself, but at a society that had failed to protect their children. Mothers collapsed upon hearing the evidence. Fathers raged in courtrooms, their voices rising above the solemn air of testimony. The anguish was not just personal but communal, for the sense of safety that bound families together had been shattered. Neighbors, too, were forced into confrontation with their own silence. Many admitted to having heard strange sounds, screams muffled in the distance, or the odd rhythms of hammering at night. Some had seen children on the farm who later vanished, but they had chosen to say nothing. Rural culture prized privacy and self-reliance, and few dared to interfere in another's household. Now, faced with the enormity of the crimes, these same neighbors confessed to feeling complicit. Guilt lingered in their testimonies, an acknowledgement that their hesitation had allowed the crimes to go on unchecked. The clergy of nearby towns interpreted the crimes through a moral lens. Sermons thundered about the decay of values in modern America, pointing to Northcott as a symbol of wickedness hiding behind the mask of respectability. Pastors reminded their congregations that even in the most humble of communities, evil could take root if vigilance was abandoned. Churches became gathering points for collective mourning, their pews filled with families clutching photographs of lost children, their voices rising in hymns that could not erase the silence left behind. Doctors and psychologists, though limited by the scientific knowledge of the time, offered their own explanations. Some described Northcott as suffering from a degenerative mental illness. Others suggested that the cruelty was learned within his family environment, pointing to the disturbing role played by his mother. Yet others saw in his crimes evidence of a broader cultural sickness, the dislocation of families in the wake of migration, the loneliness of rural isolation, the erosion of moral order in a rapidly changing world. Without modern psychiatry, their words often fell short of capturing the complexity, but they hinted at an understanding that such crimes could not be dismissed as mere aberrations. They reflected something fragile and broken in the society itself. The newspapers played perhaps the most significant role in shaping public perception. When the story broke, headlines screamed from every corner of the country. Murder farm in California, children's bones found in Wineville. Reporters flocked to the town, their cameras snapping images of the farm, of grieving parents, of the accused smirking under the weight of suspicion. The press turned the story into a national spectacle, drawing parallels to Gothic tales of horror and feeding the public's appetite for sensationalism. But in doing so, they also gave voice to the families whose cries had too long gone unheard. Columns debated whether America's obsession with progress had blinded it to the dangers festering at its edges. For the ordinary citizens of Wineville, the shock was accompanied by a desperate desire to escape the stain of association. The town itself became infamous, its name synonymous with horror. Residents found themselves judged not only for their proximity to the crimes, but for their perceived inaction. Some moved away, unable to bear the shadow. Others lobbied to change the town's name altogether, hoping to erase the memory through a simple act of renaming. When Wineville officially became Mira Loma in the years that followed, it was less a rebranding than an act of collective exorcism. The courtroom became a stage for society's reckoning. Families sat shoulder to shoulder, their eyes fixed on the man accused of destroying their lives. When Sanford Clark, the boy forced into complicity, took the stand, the gallery wept at his descriptions of terror. Journalists scribbled furiously, capturing every tremor of his voice, every detail of his suffering. The sight of a child pressed into servitude by his uncle's cruelty became a symbol of innocence corrupted, and the public recoiled in outrage. Yet there was also sympathy for Sanford, a recognition that he too had been a victim, trapped within a system of fear. Psychological commentary seeped into the public discourse. Some argued that Northcott represented the face of evil itself, irreconcilable, inhuman, beyond comprehension. Others saw him as a product of societal failure, evidence that isolation, family dysfunction, and unchecked ambition could rot the human spirit. Debates in the newspapers mirrored debates in households. Was this horror the result of one man's madness? Or did it reveal a darkness lurking in the very fabric of American life? In either case, the community could not shake the fear that if such crimes could happen in Wineville, they could happen anywhere. The reaction of the children's peers was quieter, but no less profound. Schools held vigils, desks sat empty, and classmates whispered about the farm at the edge of town. The image of their lost friends lingered in chalkboards, in abandoned school books, in the silence of playgrounds. Teachers struggled to answer questions for which they had no words. The innocence of childhood, once taken for granted, now felt fragile, as if it could be stolen at any moment by forces lurking unseen. In the end, the reactions of society formed a mosaic of grief, guilt, outrage, and reflection. Families wept for their lost children. Neighbors confessed their silence. Clergy thundered about morality. Doctors groped for explanations. Newspapers sensationalized, then moralized. And the town itself, unable to bear the burden of its name, sought to erase its identity. Yet none of these reactions could undo what had been done. The children were gone. The farm stood as a scar upon the land. And the memory of Wineville was burned into America's consciousness. The aftermath revealed a society struggling not only to comprehend the scale of the crimes, but to confront its own vulnerabilities. In their collective reaction lay a haunting recognition. The thin veneer of civilization could be pierced not by strangers in distant cities, but by neighbors just down the road. And once pierced, the wound could never fully heal. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were listening. When Gordon Stewart Northcott entered, shackled and smirking, the atmosphere shifted into something colder, something predatory. Families of the murdered children gripped photographs in their trembling hands. Mothers prayed under their breath. Fathers clenched fists on wooden benches. Every eye followed him as he sat, his posture casual, almost mocking, as though the entire proceeding were nothing more than theater staged for his amusement. In that instant, the distance between man and monster dissolved. He was no longer just an accused farmer from Wineville. He was the embodiment of something far darker, an evil that had carved itself into the flesh of the community. The testimonies began slowly, with investigators recounting the evidence unearthed at the chicken farm. Shards of bone, fragments of clothing, the stench of decay woven into the soil. Jurors averted their eyes as photographs were presented, grainy black and white images that froze horror in time. The smell of the farm seemed to creep into the courtroom itself, recalled so vividly by witnesses that people swore they could smell it in their nostrils. Metallic and foul, as though death had followed Northcott wherever he went. Each word spoken painted the image of a place that had masqueraded as ordinary, while concealing pits of despair beneath its surface. But it was Sanford Clark's testimony that turned the proceeding into a crucible of dread. The boy, pale and thin, was led to the stand. His hands shook as he took the oath. He was only a child, yet the weight of a nightmare rested on his shoulders. He spoke in a halting voice, describing nights when the air filled with screams, when the sharp edge of an axe descended with terrifying finality. He described the fear that gripped him when ordered to dig shallow graves, the way his uncle's gaze seemed to pierce through him, a gaze that promised death if he disobeyed. The gallery wept openly. Women buried their faces in handkerchiefs. Men turned away, unable to watch a boy recount what no child should have endured. The sound of his voice cracked through the room like a blade, each syllable cutting deeper into the collective conscience. Northcott, hearing it all, smiled. It was not the smile of a man cornered by justice, but of someone savoring the chaos he had unleashed. He leaned back, whispering to his lawyers, occasionally letting out soft laughs that only heightened the sense of inhumanity. That smile became a symbol of everything unholy about him, a reminder that he thrived in the suffering of others, that his satisfaction came not only from his crimes, but from the agony they continued to cause. The judge, stern and deliberate, tried to hold order. Yet at one point, the fury of the families broke through. A father lunged forward, shouting curses, restrained only by deputies. His words echoed through the courtroom. "Monster devil!" The trial was no longer simply about law. It had become a stage where grief, rage, and fear collided head-on with the face of cruelty. The struggle between civility and raw emotion played out in real time, as if the entire society itself was on trial, forced to confront what it had allowed to fester in its shadows. Outside the courthouse, the crowds grew larger each day. Reporters described throngs of citizens pressing against the doors, holding signs demanding justice, chanting prayers, shouting Northcott's name with venom. Some came with lanterns, invoking images of an older era when mobs sought their own vengeance. Police stood guard, fearing that the trial could ignite into violence at any moment. The courthouse had become the eye of a storm, and America was watching. Radios carried the updates, newspapers printed every lurid detail, and in living rooms across the nation, people spoke the name Wineville with dread. The climax of testimony came when forensic evidence was laid bare. The jury was shown the tiny bones recovered from the earth, bones so fragile they crumbled when touched. Experts described them in painstaking detail, child-sized remains, impossible to dismiss as anything but human. Every word landed like a hammer. The courtroom sat frozen, haunted by the knowledge that these fragments were all that remained of the missing children. There were no bodies to lay in coffins, no graves to visit, only scattered remnants, stripped of identity, reduced to mute testimony from the soil itself. It was as if the earth had become the final witness, unwilling to conceal the atrocities any longer. And then came Northcott's voice. Against the advice of his attorneys, he took the stand. The gallery leaned forward, breathless, as he began to speak. His words were fragmented, erratic, oscillating between denial and twisted boasts. He taunted the court with half-confessions, leaving gaps large enough to keep everyone guessing. At moments he denied everything, at others he hinted at even greater horrors, at crimes not yet discovered. His voice rose and fell with a rhythm that unsettled, like a man both relishing his role and losing control of his own narrative. The jurors watched in horror as he unraveled before them not a man seeking mercy, but a figure consumed by his own darkness. The climax of his testimony was a chilling declaration. Looking directly at the parents in the gallery, he whispered, "They'll never rest. Not them, not you, not anyone. What I did doesn't end here." His words hung in the air, poisonous, inescapable. A gasp ran through the courtroom. Some mothers screamed, others fainted, and a wave of panic swept the room. The judge slammed his gavel repeatedly, but the order was already shattered. In that moment, it felt as though Northcott had succeeded in his final cruelty, not only in what he had done to the children, but in ensuring that the terror would echo long after his own body was gone. When the verdict was read guilty on all counts, the crowd erupted. Some wept with relief, others shouted with rage. Northcott sat still, his smirk finally gone, his eyes flat and cold. But the tension did not lift. Even in his conviction, he seemed to hold power, as if the fear he sowed had become immortal. As deputies led him away, shackles clinking, he turned back one last time to face the gallery. No words were spoken, but his stare was enough. It was a stare that promised memory, that guaranteed his name would never vanish, that the horror would remain stitched into the skin of the town forever. The execution, when it came, was meant to be the resolution. But as the rope tightened and Northcott dropped, silence followed, not relief, not justice, but silence. A silence so profound it echoed the hush of the chicken farm at night, when the world seemed to stop just before another scream. For those who lost children, closure never came. For Wineville, the stain never faded. The climax had been reached, yet the terror did not end with it. It lingered, in the soil, in the memories, in the very air of California's countryside. This was the truth of the Wineville chicken coop murders, that even in the moment of reckoning, even at the peak of justice, horror lived on. It lived in the eyes of grieving parents, in the voices of children who would never grow old, and in the heart of a nation forced to admit that its innocence had been shattered by a farm at the edge of town. When the dust settled and the gavel had long since fallen silent, California was left with something more enduring than a verdict. The Wineville chicken coop murders had not only stolen lives, but had reshaped an entire community's identity. The town itself sought escape from the shadow. In 1930, only 2 years after Northcott's execution, the name Wineville was legally erased from maps, replaced with Miraloma. It was as if the residents believed that by changing a word, they could bury the horror that had seeped into every fence post and grain of soil. But a new name could not cleanse memory. It could not silence the whispers that carried on the night wind, nor could it erase the fact that the ground still held the bones of children whose names might never be known. For the families, justice was not a balm. Many lived the rest of their lives in the half-light of unanswered questions. Some children had been identified, but others remained phantoms lost without faces, remembered only through fragments of clothing or a few fragile bones. Parents kept waiting for closure that never came, standing at windows in the twilight, half expecting a knock, half fearing one. The absence of certainty became its own torment. What if their child had been spared? What if they had been taken elsewhere? The human mind clings to hope even when it festers into poison. And for some, that hope stretched on for decades, an invisible shackle that bound them to the nightmare. Psychologists of the era struggled to explain the case. They wrote in journals about psychopathy, about the cold detachment of Northcott, about the fragile mind of Sanford Clark, and the unthinkable trauma inflicted on him. Yet even these explanations felt thin against the enormity of the crimes. Words like insanity and evil were repeated, but neither seemed adequate. How could language possibly capture the reality of a farm that had become a factory of suffering? The silence of the children spoke louder than the textbooks ever could. The unanswered questions about accomplices, motives, and missing victims lingered like fog that refused to lift. The cultural shockwaves spread far beyond Riverside County. Newspapers across America printed stories about the case for years, and even abroad the name Wineville was whispered with dread. Parents warned children not to stray too far, not to trust strangers, not to linger on lonely roads. The mythos of the chicken coop grew into something larger than fact. It became folklore, a ghost story whispered at night, a cautionary tale with roots in real soil. Some swore the farm was cursed, that those who passed near it could hear faint cries carried on the wind. Others believed the spirits of the murdered lingered, refusing to let go until their names were spoken again. Whether superstition or not, the land itself seemed marked, its history written in something deeper than ink. As the years passed, the story refused to die. Writers, criminologists, and journalists revisited it, peeling back layers, trying to make sense of the senseless. Yet every attempt to explain seemed only to deepen the abyss. The more one stared into the details, the more it felt as though the case resisted resolution, as though Northcott's chilling prophecy in the courtroom that the nightmare would never end had come true in its own way. Even his death could not silence him. His crimes had carved scars into the collective memory, scars that outlived the man himself. What remains most haunting, perhaps, is the reminder of how fragile safety truly is. In 1928, families had trusted that the countryside was a place of honesty and hard work, that a farmer was a man of soil and sweat. Yet behind a chicken coop's wooden walls lay something that shattered those illusions forever. The case became a mirror for society, forcing people to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil does not always arrive as a shadowy figure in the night. Sometimes it wears the face of a neighbor, a relative, a man buying groceries at the same market. It forced a reckoning with the idea that horror can grow quietly, in plain sight, nourished by secrecy and silence. Today, nearly a century later, the echoes of Wineville remain. The land has been built over, the farm long dismantled, yet its story is told again and again, in court documents, in films, in the hushed tones of historians and locals. The soil that once yielded crops still hides its past beneath layers of dust. And sometimes, on nights when the fog rolls thick over Riverside County, some say the air carries whispers, whispers of children lost, of justice incomplete, of a name erased from maps but not from memory. Perhaps that is the final truth of Wineville, that history does not bury its dead so easily. It keeps them alive in our stories, in the warnings we pass on, in the uneasy silence that follows when we speak the name Gordon Stewart Northcott. The town may be Miraloma now, but Wineville lives on in the haunted corners of America's past, a reminder that horror, once unleashed, never truly disappears. It waits, it lingers, it shadows the edges of our collective memory, ensuring that those who suffered are never completely forgotten. And so the story closes, not with resolution, but with a question. Is it possible for a place, a people, or a nation to ever fully escape such darkness? Or does it remain with us, a ghost tethered not to a farm in California, but to the very act of remembering itself? The answer may never come, and perhaps that is fitting, for some horrors were never meant to be neatly resolved. They exist to remind us that beneath the surface of ordinary life, there will always be shadows waiting, silent and patient, until we dare to look again.